And next, for our person of interest, today on the show we're highlighting not just a person of interest but a concept of interest. It was back in 23 when YAAR, which is a popular Gen Z-driven media organization, they introduced India's first chat show on positive masculinity. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second, but it's called Be a Man, YAAR. Last season was filled with vulnerable conversations. You had names like Nasiruddin Shah, Karan Johar, Vicky Kaushal. The show is now back with its second season, and its host Nikhil Taneja is actually with us. He says it's going to be about the humanity behind masculinity. But what does that actually mean, and who will we get to hear from this season? Take a look first at this teaser.
When my family was going through that, मैं उस कगार पे था जहाँ पे मैं फिल्म्स भी छोड़ सकता था उस टाइम. That was the time I used to cry a lot.
A woman is a human being as much as this man is. यही है feminist.
I've gone to numerous companies asking for sponsorship, but I've been declined.
मेरे स्कार्स मेरे लिए मेरी प्राइड है. वो स्कार्स रहेंगे तो मुझे पता रहेगा कि हाँ मैंने ट्रांजिशन किया है.
मेल लोनलीनेस दुनिया के सबसे बड़े खतरों में है.
How do you respect a man who's not earning? How do you respect a man who's not getting up and going to work? The guy who's just lying down on a sofa and crying about his feelings.
Angry young man सिर्फ angry नहीं था, वो deeply hurt था.
अगर आपको रोना नहीं आता है तो जरूरी नहीं है, लेकिन अगर आता है तो छिप के रोने की जरूरत नहीं.
If you're not going to love yourself, how can you expect someone else to love you?
Be a man, yaar.
Be a man, yaar.
Be a man, yaar.
पर सबसे पहले be a human, यार.
Nikhil, what important, exciting content to start our Monday morning with. We're so happy you're actually starting the week with us here on the show, because we'll get to start with this very, very important conversation. Let me just tell our audiences, you're also the co-founder and chief of YAAR. I wanted to give them that context. Let me start you, Nikhil, with a question that is possibly a question you had to answer a lot when you started this entire venture. What did you see as the need for this space?
First of all, thank you, Toya, for having me. And thank you for all the very, very kind things that you have said. So as you said that I run a company called YAAR, and as part of what we do, we go across the country and we do a lot of campus roadshows. So I have at this point been to over 150 campuses. I've been to IITs, IIMs, AIMS, NITs, NIFTs, so on and so forth. Met a lot of young people on ground, over 10,000 young people. And every single time we try to create a safe space for them to express themselves without judgment. We hear two things prominently. Among young women, we hear a lot about harassment. We hear how they're being objectified by society day in and day out. And among young men, we constantly hear about loneliness. We hear that there is no one who, I've heard things like they haven't gotten hugged in life, nobody said I love you to them. Their parents haven't given them any physical intimacy. And while women always speak of this sisterhood that they have that helps them survive in society, men constantly talk about not having any spaces to express their emotion. So that was really one of the key reasons that I felt like, can we create an online safe space for young men for them to feel a little less lonely when they see iconic men on screen being expressive, being emotional. Maybe they might also feel like they can do it too.
Can you tell me, because we told our audiences the theme almost is positive masculinity and has always been.
Yeah.
And you do have, so for example, in the US, you have a show called Man Enough, The Man Enough rather. And
Correct.
it's similar in the sense that it wants to create a positive space. But I want to ask you, and you kind of touched on this right now, when you're having these conversations in the Indian context with Indian men, are you seeing differences in the Western and the Indian approach to masculinity?
I think, first of all, I'm a huge fan of Justin Baldoni and Man Enough, and he is absolutely one of my inspirations. In fact, he gave a shout out to the show last year as well. But I feel like masculinity, unfortunately, has become toxic for everywhere in the world. I think patriarchy has been such an oppressive thing for everyone across centuries. Now we have a bit of an understanding how patriarchy oppresses women. After many, many centuries, we are starting to recognize the effects on that. Unfortunately, we don't still understand that patriarchy also affects the boys. in our world and in our country, it asks boys to become men before they're ever allowed to be human. And I think that's an issue we don't even talk about much. I don't see that there's much of a difference in the West or in India. I feel like patriarchal standards are the same everywhere. There are gender norms everywhere. But in India, some of it sometimes get amplified, especially in fields like education. So you have boys who are told to be providers. You need to do engineering, you need to do medical, you need to be a lawyer. And you can't really ever do anything that seems like it could be nurturing to you. Whereas women, of course, have always been told that, you know, your role is that of a nurturer, and doing and education or providing may not be your thing. So I think gender norms start so early and stereotypes start so early that it becomes very difficult as people grow up, and especially as men grow up, for them to try to break out of it.
I want to ask you, Nikhil, a slightly tougher question. When you're having this conversation with us right now, some of the words you're using, for example, patriarchy, earlier we talked about the concept of toxic masculinity. I do know that there is a certain, not to put them in a box, but there may be a certain age group of men whose ears automatically close. Let's say men and women, because I know women who are of that age group too, who they might hear words like that and automatically say, this is either a liberal conversation, too young people's conversation. So I do want to ask you, because you do have older guests. We just saw Javed Saab on your show right now for the new season. You've had Nasiruddin Shah. How do you approach these topics when you're talking to, I don't want to put them in a box again, but that generation?
No, I absolutely, I hear you and I agree with you. To explain this concept, I use these terms, but on the show, for example, none of these terms even exist beyond a point of time. The show is about emotion. It's about vulnerability. It is about feeling. It's not so much about opinion. So in fact, we have 3-hour conversations with every guest. We only put about an hour of that conversation out, and that hour is typically the guest being vulnerable, the guest being honest, the guest being raw. We try to go beyond their ideas about masculinity, their ideas about gender, but really about how it has affected them and about the emotion they have because of gender. So I do recognize that this is a conversation that people switch off about, because some of it has been also weaponized. It has been used angrily online by a lot of people who are sometimes anti-women, sometimes they believe that this conversation is anti-men. On the other hand, our show is really about empathy. It actually tries to tap into the humanity of men. So we try very hard to stay away from words, but try to really focus on emotion.
I want to ask you, Nikhil, when you were saying, you know, that spaces don't exist for men to have these conversations. One of the arguments I see, a counter argument that I see a lot of people make, is that certain spaces like sports have always been there for men to develop a relationship with each other, and that relationship often allows for competition in a way that women aren't naturally taught to cultivate. But I just want to ask you, when you create a space like this, what do you want to see? Because you obviously want to see more of such conversations, but what do you want to see in general more from the men around you? And I'm talking about young and old.
See, you're absolutely right. I feel like, you know, two men talking is one of the biggest tropes, you know, of the podcast world. You can't see, I have yet to see enough podcasts about women even hosting or talking, and then this one is another one, another chat show where there is like two men talking. So I do understand the tropiness of it. I do understand that men do get tons and tons of opportunities. They have a lot of privilege. They have many outlets of expressing themselves. But the thing is, the thing that they miss out on is our outlets where they're able to be emotional. And I feel like that's a very big difference. Like, I've always felt like men can go to war for each other, but they can't cry in front of each other. Have you, you know, I can't imagine a man really like losing themselves in front of another man and asking for a hug. Something as simple as a hug is sometimes, you see how gendered hugs are? When a man holds his mother, you know, or holds, you know, a female partner, there is the hug itself is all encompassing. It's like, it fills you in. But when men hug each other, there's always like this tap on the back of the, you know,
the side pattern.
It's always like this awkward thing that, hey, let's get over with this, cool, we are men, we're cool. We don't need to show emotion and empathy. We need to just stay a little distant from it. So sports, in fact, is one of the areas where men are able to, again, come closer to each other. And yet, we see when, for example, in this World Cup, it was so beautiful to see so many men cry. One of my favorite things about the World Cup this year was every man kind of just letting loose. Rohit Sharma on the ground in tears, everyone else watching, there was real emotion. And I wish we were able to express that as a country a lot more. I wish we were able to express that in our lives a lot more. And that's what this show is really trying to do. We're trying to create these spaces where we say that it's okay to talk about emotion. It's okay to cry. It's okay to have like encompassing hugs. I've hugged every guest on the show and I've tried to hold that hug in for a little while.
You were talking about the World Cup and there's so much footage of all the cricketers kissing each other on the faces. And I was actually reading a lot of Twitter users, ex-users rather saying, wow, it's so rare to see this kind of stuff. So I totally agree with you and it is very, very beautiful. Let me just ask you, Nikhil, one of the guests you had, I just thought it was done so beautifully. You had Karthik Aaryan, and let me just tell our audiences that episode is already out. And Karthik Aaryan is someone who, in a lot of parts of the internet, people have said, yo, this film you did, it could be looked at as sexist. And you had a really refreshing way of tackling that. You took it head on. You asked him to talk about the goods of being a woman too, because in Pyar Ka Panchnama, there's that famous line where he talks about all the things that are wrong. How do you, just tell us, how do you end up, when you have guests, how do you end up approaching topics like this without, you don't want to offend anyone, they come from their place where they think they're correct, but it's an important question. So how do you balance that?
Yeah. I'm very honest with everyone who comes on the show. I tell them very much in advance, this is what I'm going to be tackling. I don't tell them questions, but I do tell them themes. I try to create a place, again, of trust. Safe space as a word and as a phrase is so important to me because I feel like, especially, unfortunately, journalism, I've come from a journalism background. I used to be in Hindustan Times. I was a media reporter myself. And I feel like, almost all journalism spaces when it comes to entertainment have become so sensational. Everyone's always trying to look for that gotcha moment. Right. Whereas, in our space, we try to do this with a little bit of respect. We try to keep a little bit of dignity around it. And at the same time, try to make everyone comfortable. It's never done in a way where I'm just trying to get people to say something controversial and then I put it out. In fact, if you see that even when we put out the clips, we don't actually put out a lot of the hard stuff that people have said. We let that be for the episode. We only put out themes and we let people come in and see some of the harder stuff. Some of the, things that people have said in the moments of most vulnerability. Because we don't, again, want to sensationalize that. Right. We don't want people to be like, oh, wow, look at this one, great phrase that this person has said so that all headlines can pick it up. Come to the episode, see the context in which it is being said, and you'll realize that the conversation is very respectful and very, hopefully, with a little bit of grace and a little bit of dignity.
Nikhil, I want to ask you lastly, again, maybe this is a slightly tough question, but the guests that you have on the show, of course, they know that they're coming to do this. They know they're coming to have a soft conversation with you. But I want to ask you, if you had to tell our audience members, our TBC family, how to have conversations like this with men in their life, even for the men who are watching, how they can have more of these conversations. Obviously, actors know they're going to come there, they're going to open up, but what are your tips for the everyman?
I absolutely love this question and thank you for asking this because I actually get asked this question a lot, especially in campuses. A lot of students ask me this question because they say that, we do want to express, but, we fear judgment. We don't know how to talk about our feelings with other people because anytime we do it, we sometimes get shamed for it. Sometimes we get told that, you are not really being, man, you're not being macho by actually expressing yourself. So the advice that I've always given is, don't be the man who wants to talk first, try to be the man who listens first. If you want to create safe spaces around you, you need to initiate that safe space by going to another man in your life and just being the person who listens. And if you are able to do that, and that's why I feel also our show kind of works, because you'll see a lot of the show is just me listening. It's me not interrupting anyone until they finished a thought. Even if that thought goes on for 5 minutes, I keep quiet. I want everyone to be able to fully, completely be able to express themselves.
Nikhil, I'm just interrupting you for a second to ask you. Just going to stop you for a second. A lot of the men I know will be very open with their girlfriends or their partners. They can do that easily. So I just want to ask you, when they already have that, how do we show them that even this could be a great, even talking to your fellow men about something that seems too sentimental, that could be the right road to go down?
No, you're absolutely right again, Toya. I feel like, unfortunately, men understand that it's okay for us to express in front of emotion, because that's what we have seen with our mothers. Our mothers are the one who show us empathy when we're growing up, and our fathers are always the ones who kind of are, you know, a little bit stuck up, a little bit distant, because that's what they have been taught. So it's nobody's really fault. Patriarchy has made sure that men have always remained stiff and women have taken the emotional burden of creating spaces for men. And our show is trying to change that a little bit. We are saying that, you know, you don't really have to rely only on the women in your lives. And I think it's unfair to women to always take the emotional burden of listening to the men. And men who are feeling lonely are always speaking about it, but not creating these spaces among themselves. And that's what we want to do. Go to a fellow man, start being the listener first. In a world where everyone has something to say, try to be the person who listens, and I promise you that your fellow man is then going to create the same space for you. Everyone's afraid of a space like that because of judgment. But if you create a judgment-free space, they are going to reciprocate, and you will see some of your closest friends using that space. Where earlier, unfortunately, it only takes alcohol for men to express among other men. I feel like we require non-alcoholic, sober spaces for men to get emotional with each other.
Nikhil, you've done that. You've created that. And I'm so happy you're the flag bearer of this. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, for taking out time on a Monday morning and giving us this really beautiful, really positive message to start our entire week with. Thank you.
That really means a lot, Toya. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for joining us. Okay.